Imagine being denied a home loan, not because of your credit, your income, or your ability to repay, but simply because of the color of your skin. Imagine entire neighborhoods marked in red ink, warning banks and lenders that these areas were risky investments not because of economic reasons, but because black families lived there. This was not an accident, it was policy. For decades, redlining shaped America's cities, suburbs, and racial geography. It determined where people could live, what schools their children could attend, and how wealth or poverty would pass from one generation to the next. And though redlining was officially outlawed decades ago, its impact is still felt today. In fact, it's embedded in our roads, our housing markets, our school systems, and in the deep economic divide between white and black America. So, what exactly was redlining? Who created it? And how did it reshape the American dream into something very different depending on your race? Let's start with a story. In the early 20th century, cities across the United States were growing fast. Immigrants were arriving by the millions. African Americans, fleeing racial violence in the South, moved north in what we now call the Great Migration. They sought opportunity, freedom, and a chance to build something for themselves. But instead of being welcomed, many were funneled into overcrowded, poorly maintained neighborhoods, often the only places they were allowed to live. Banks wouldn't lend to them. Realtors refused to show them homes in white areas. And white families, fearful of property value decline, moved out when black families moved in. Then came the federal government. In 1933, as part of the New Deal, the U.S. government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. Its job was to stabilize housing during the Great Depression. To do this, HOLC created maps of major cities across America, color-coded maps to guide banks on where to invest. Green meant best, blue meant still desirable, yellow signaled definitely declining, and red, the infamous red zones, meant hazardous. But here's the problem. These ratings weren't just about economics, they were about race. If a neighborhood had black residents, or even the potential for integration, it was marked in red. No matter how stable the community, how well kept the homes, or how hard-working the families, redlining declared them unworthy of loans, investment, or growth. The result? A massive wealth-building machine was turned off for millions of people based solely on race. This wasn't just theoretical. Redlining had teeth. Banks refused to give mortgages in redlined areas. Insurance companies denied coverage. City planners refused infrastructure upgrades. Even public services like trash collection or street repairs were deprioritized. Meanwhile, white families in green and blue areas received government-backed loans with low interest rates, helping them buy homes, build equity, and pass wealth onto their children. Over time, the gap widened. While white families accumulated assets and stability, black families were stuck renting, often in overcrowded and neglected neighborhoods. Homeownership, the single greatest source of wealth in America, was simply out of reach, and it didn't stop at housing. Schools were funded by property taxes, so redland areas already devalued received fewer resources. Hospitals were fewer and farther between. Grocery stores left, polluting industries moved in. Highways were built through black neighborhoods, dividing and displacing communities that had existed for generations. This is why, even today, formerly redland areas still suffer from underinvestment, poor health outcomes, low-performing schools, and generational poverty. Let's make this personal. Imagine being a black veteran returning from World War II. You risked your life for your country. You qualify for a GI Bill loan to buy a house. But when you walk into the bank, you're told, not in that neighborhood. The suburbs are off limits. The dream of homeownership is denied, not because of your service, but because of your skin. Now imagine being the child of that veteran. You grow up in a redland neighborhood with underfunded schools, no parks, and a sense that the American dream was meant for someone else. Multiply that story by millions. That's the scale of redlining's impact. In 1968, The Fair Housing Act made redlining illegal, but by then, the damage was already done. Decades of discrimination had created two Americas, one with opportunity, the other fenced off by maps drawn in ink but enforced by institutions. Even after redlining ended, banks and developers found new ways to exclude: racial steering, subprime loans, gentrification. The legacy evolved, even as the language changed. Today, if you look at maps of wealth, education, life expectancy, and even tree coverage in major cities, they still align almost perfectly with the redline maps of the 1930s. In other words, history is still alive on our streets, in our policies, and in our bank accounts. So why is this still important? Because the consequences of redlining, not just historical, they're structural. They explain why white families have, on average, 10 times the wealth of black families. Why black homeownership rates remain far below those of white Americans. Why bad neighborhoods were designed to fail. You can't fix a system unless you understand how it was built. And redlining wasn't a fluke. It was a blueprint for racial inequality. That's why cities across the country now facing calls to invest in formerly redlined areas not as charity, but as a long overdue correction. Some local governments are using historical maps to guide reparative investments. Others are providing grants and homeownership assistance to families locked out for generations. It's not about guilt, it's about accountability. In the end, redlining is more than a story about housing. It's a story about who gets to belong, who gets to build, dream, and pass something on. It's about how policy becomes geography, how ink becomes destiny. And it's about the power of maps not just to guide us, but to divide us. But if maps can be used to exclude, they can also be used to repair. The first step, facing the lines we've drawn.